Welcome to the Labyrinth. I'm your host Pratham Padav. My guest today is Liam DeBoer. I hope I've pronounced his name right. So Liam is a very awakened person. He's a content creator and writer. The links to his Instagram and YouTube page is in the description below, so do check them out. In his channel, he talks about philosophy, religion, freedom, wokeism, and so much more. So without any further ado, let's begin the podcast. All right, Liam, welcome to the Labyrinth. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, brother. Thanks for having me on here. I'm looking forward to chatting.
So, when did you begin publishing your content and what motivated you?
It was about 2 years ago, and motivation. It was a very spur of the moment thing. Actually, I never really planned on making content or being outspoken on this kind of stuff. And it was in the height of the pandemic, and it was about December 2020, I think. And just I had made a video talking about just the mental health effect that was having on on people during lockdowns, and this was back before there was ever even vaccine talk or anything. So this was when, talking, criticizing lockdowns in any way other than like this is a must thing do was very similar to what it was like for criticizing vaccines at one point. And so, I just made this video kind of talking about mental health, outlining a few stories of friends or people I knew that kind of went off on a pretty brutal path there for a bit or whatever. And yeah, it just kind of clicked, and there was a lot of people kind of saying it was one of those things where a lot of people were reaching out saying that they connected, that I'm glad somebody else sees it this way. I hadn't heard anyone else kind of talk about it, and I had people from both ends of the political aisle coming, like, saying that as well, like the pro-lockdown people and the anti-lockdown people. They were both like, I'm glad somebody's talking about this because yeah, it's important. And then that's when I was just like, all right, I guess there's a lot of people that just are looking for someone to say how they feel. And I think it's because this is such an, like, what's happening in the world right now on so many different fronts, not even just the pandemic. There's such novel experiences. I think everyone kind of has this underlying feeling of like something's not right here, something's happening. Like this is not the same as 10 years ago, like just my day-to-day life. And so I think there's just kind of a yearning for somebody that can just bring some common sense and logic to that area, and so that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this COVID era has changed a lot of us in different ways. It's made us more skeptical of the government.
Mm-hmm.
How has this whole COVID era changed you as a person?
Oh, it flipped me upside down for sure. I can't say I've ever been hard rooted belief one way or another, like say political or government wise or any of this kind of stuff. Like even before the pandemic, I definitely wasn't a the government's my friend person, but maybe I wasn't as kind of set in my in my understanding of that or my beliefs on that. But yeah, for me, it mainly switched my life up in what I do for personal pursuits. So, like, before the pandemic, I was a bar manager at a brewery and I was a musician. And both of those industries, like restaurants and music, were two of the hardest hit, right? So I left both of those. I switched, and then I got into videography and stuff, and then now I'm speaking online and stuff as well. So that's kind of the creative passion side for me, and then still doing a lot of, like, yeah, videography work. So wouldn't be doing any of this if it wasn't for COVID. So that's so as much as I don't agree with what happened. I'm not even bitter in the fact of being like, oh, I wish it never happened, because I mean, I'm doing some stuff that I'm pretty excited about right now. So I'm like, all right, cool. Like, I'll keep rolling with that.
Yeah, as a Canadian, what were your thoughts on the Canadian truckers protest?
Yeah, I thought I thought, well, I was simultaneously like I was pretty shocked at the coverage of it. Um, you can disagree with what they were protesting, or even the fact that that they were protesting at all. Um, that's totally fair, but I don't think a lot of people even closely got a good representation of what that protest was actually like. The media and the government turned it around, and it was very instantly it became an occupation. They were a threat to our like our global trade relations. They like which they were planning to attack. They found guns, all of this kind of stuff, and it's like none of that happened. Like that was not the case at all. And there would be little moments where the media would smear them because, say, there was a clip of somebody posted online that was like peeing on a war monument, and it's like, yeah, sure, that's brutal. But then what ended up happening was the protesters every day would start clearing and like setting flowers on the memorials and like shoveling the snow off them and like essentially making them look really nice. So like yeah, sure, there was one little dick in the crowd that wanted to like piss on this statue, but then the rest of the protest was like, oh, we won't have that, and then ended up starting taking care of everything. And so even to a lot of the businesses in Ottawa, they make it seem like everyone was like frightened for their lives and stuff in Ottawa, but a lot of the like on the ground accounts that I've seen outside of the main like the corporate media in Canada, there was a lot of businesses talking about how it was great for their business, how like their downtown businesses were, just the truckers were always in there and stuff, and even the government shut down one business for serving the truckers. They were like a coffee restaurant kind of thing, and like the government shut them down and came after them afterwards and tried to punish them for even being friendly with the protest essentially. And so I think that was like, to me, I was looking at it like, I can see why some people would disagree with this for what it really is, but it shouldn't have generated the emotional backlash that it did, because that was just all based on complete media, top to bottom misconceptions of the protest. But so,
Yeah, what was really shocking to me was the way the government froze certain bank accounts who
right.
donated to the truckers. That was
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, like, so to put it in perspective about how hard they came down and, on this protest, they enacted the Emergencies Act, which that was only the third time in Canadian history it's ever been done. And one time was when there was a war, and then another time was when there was a legitimate terrorist attack in the in Quebec, I believe it was. And so, and then these peaceful, very peaceful protesters, like people can try to again misconstrue it however they want, but there was police reports and the rate of crimes went down in Toronto during this protest. Or sorry, in Ottawa. Um, so it's like it was definitely peaceful. It actually made the city more peaceful, and so yeah, no, it's insane that they went to that length to essentially to put in place the Emergencies Act. You have to say that the nation is under a direct threat, and it's like, that was that really the case? Was just these, you know, they were well coordinated too, and that's what I think made them such a threat to the government, Trudeau's government, was because they were very well organized, and they were getting a lot of coverage online, and they couldn't keep finding ways to smear them, so they just had to end up going with that route. But yeah, that's crazy. It's on another level.
Yeah, I'm sure you became more skeptical of the government after the COVID, but did you also feel a sense of disappointment with the people and with the public, with looking at how easy it is to brainwash the public, looking at how subservient the people around you are towards the government, and even when I was looking at all these late night US talk shows where they're
Yeah.
promoting, where they're literally worshipping Fauci,
Yeah.
it was clear that this was the new religion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and yeah, so like I tried not to go down that path because I do try to remember that a lot of people, deal with they've got a lot of problems in their own lives, their personal lives that kind of consume them. So maybe they only have like 5% bandwidth to process all of this kind of stuff. And if that's what you've got, like, if you're buried in debt and you've got kids and, you're not you're not spending 2 or 3 hours a day deep diving shit like I am, and in really getting an understanding of all this. So with that 5% bandwidth or whatever, you're kind of forced to just take in the general narrative, and that's all you have time to even in mental space to comprehend. And I get that some people's lives are like that, and so I try not to hold it against them, or be like upset at them per se. And then I just, the only people that upset me, so like the general population, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a terrifying thing that the general population can be swayed so easily, and and then also just forget about it immediately and not have any questions. Like the fact that people are just like now like, okay, we're good, we're just moving on. It's like, no, don't you want to figure out why none of this shit worked, what they were actually doing it for, and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so I try not to get angry at them, but the people that do upset me are the very fervent ones that are on the team of the government and really pushing them, and they claim to be for the people, but they're simultaneously championing everything the government does and says. And I'm like, those are the people that I'm like, you're so misguided, and you're not just sitting here being like, okay, I'm not really sure what to think, so just tell me what to do. That's one thing, but then to sit here and go, I understand this enough to, uh, to know that you should be forced to be made a medical decision and all of this kind of stuff. That's a completely different thing, and those people I will take issue with,
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, I like how you portrayed it as these people who claim that they are for the people, for the to use the communist language, for the proletariat, and yet
Yeah,
they are doing so much against them.
yeah,
See, during the COVID era, I became more skeptical of the COVID authoritarianism, but I also began starting questioning. I also began questioning about other things like, is climate change really as serious as Greta Thunberg says it is?
yeah.
Right? And I got into an argument with a friend of mine who's quite socialist, who's like, he's an Indian socialist intellectual, like a huge Bernie Sanders, Noam Chomsky kind of a
Okay.
person. So we were talking about climate change, and I just pointed out that it's so strange that you, the socialists, talk about how you want to support the proletariat, yet there are so many farmers in places like the Netherlands who are protesting against climate change policies that hurt agricultural businesses. So
Yeah.
isn't that ironic?
Yeah. Yeah, and no, and so that it doesn't make any sense to me at all. And it's funny because I'm very torn on some people in that space. Like for instance, even a Bernie Sanders. I have deep respect for Bernie Sanders because he does seem genuinely principled, and he's kind of had the same stance and platform his whole life. He's not one of these guys that, depending on what the public's saying at a certain time, like, I mean, obviously he may pick up little stuff, but not just like doing complete 180s on his beliefs like you see a lot of politicians do. But but yeah, I do. It doesn't add up to me when you look at all of these policies. They seem to be a direct centralization. If you look at every single one of these issues, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's economic inequality, whether it's racial issues, all of this stuff, no matter what it is, the answer is always just more government centralization of power. And so, when you got to look at that, and I think too, the thing that I always try to point out to people is you got to look at incentives, because people's incentives, and like we run on incentive structures as humans, and we're not going to, like, these people aren't in the positions they're in because their incentive is to help the people. They're there to help themselves and the institutions that serve them. And so everything that they do is going to probably increase the capacity that these people have to do what they want to do in these institutions. So just giving it more power. And I think that's what's happening with all of these things. And even if it, and I'm not even on the train where it's like, you know, I've read quite a bit on climate change and done a lot, and I don't think it's as serious as they say it is. I don't think it's apocalyptic. I think it's happening. I think there's going to be negative repercussions, but there's nothing showing me that it's a threat to human civilization. You know, but it's very strange to me that that all of these things that, you know, but even socialists in general, it's tough because they claim even the policies and their general socialist idea that they support, it claims to be for the people, but it really does just take away power. It centralizes power away from the people. And so I don't really understand the logic on these kind of things a lot, or when people say that they want to help. It's a very, I mean, it's collectivist idea, I guess. It's going towards that, and I think that's why they band together with them, and that's why that messaging of, you know, doing the right thing for your neighbors, or this is what Canadians do, or this is what, you know, whoever does, this a good people do. It's like they're very the collectivist in nature, I guess, is probably the best way to think about it.
Yeah. Liam, why don't you trust the experts?
I do. I trust some. I just don't trust all blindly. Like, you know, if you look back, you can find experts that were saying smoking was healthy. You can find experts that said sugar was healthy. You can find experts that were saying that heroin should be an over-the-counter drug. You can find, like, there. To think that at any point we've reached the pinnacle of understanding and that we have like a very firm understanding of everything, and you know, that there can be no possible consequences to what the experts lay out, or the experts, it's just some, it's mostly government funded ones. But you know, if you trust them, then yeah, supposedly everything's going to go fine, but time and time again we see that that's not the case at all. And you know, even Trudeau's now saying that with what happened during COVID, you can see the capabilities that we have to address things like climate change and all of this kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, so he's straight up saying, like, look at the tyrannical measures that we took in COVID can now be applied to climate change. And so, yeah, again, when you look at what the experts, what the experts are recommending, it all goes towards centralization of power again. And that's how I really look at it, because a lot of people try to make it seem, and this is what I really try to stay out of, is because, like, if you notice, even in my posts, I never talk about right versus left. I never say liberals. I never say conservatives, because I think those terms are meaningless at this point. But I really think the real battle isn't, right versus left, or liberal versus conservative, or, you know, Christian versus Muslim, or any of this kind of stuff. It's literally just centralization versus decentralization, and that's where I see the fight occurring.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And it's so strange when they say, why don't you trust the experts? And when you do point out to certain experts, like Dr. Robert Malone or Dr. Peter Muccolo, who actually disagree with the COVID policies, they'll say, hey, you know what, ignore those experts. Only listen to the experts like Fauci, or the ones who agree with my opinion. So it's so strange, because there is a sense of intellectual inconsistency. And also when it comes to climate change, there is this logical fallacy of shifting goalposts, because so many experts have claimed prior to this that, hey, you know what, the Arctics are going to melt by 2015, it's going to melt by 2013, and then Greta deletes her tweet in which she said that the world's water would be rising by 2023 or something like that, and then she deletes
she said humanity will be done for if we don't stop in 5 years, and then 5 years came up and she deleted the tweet. So it's you know, even on that front, okay, let's even say their predictions are true, their science is right. This is the number one issue that I see with climate change, and this is typically how I try to get through it to people on. But like, the climate is something that is a 30-year period. Like even the WMO and all of these organizations, they all classify the climate as a 30-year period. Other than that, it's just weather. So when people post and say, "Oh, this one tornado happened. Look how bad climate change is." It's like you cannot use any single weather event to point to climate change. And you have to look at a totality of a 30-year span. And then so on top of that, any CO2 emitted stays in the atmosphere for up to 60 years. So any changes you make right now won't have a measurable change for at least 60. You won't even be able to see whether what you're doing is working for 60 years. You can know, okay, we're not putting out as much emissions, but what effect that has on the climate, you won't know for 60 years. So, it's the goals are immeasurable, and I think a lot of people too don't realize the cost at what these goals come to, that are laid out by the Paris Agreement. It will cost Bjorn Lomborg lays this out. He's an economist that does a great job on climate change, and he's actually wrote a book talking about the how to make the world a place with $175 billion or $75 billion, I think it was, but about essentially where money spent could make the best improvements to humanity in the world as a whole, like in the environment and all this kind of stuff. But he laid out the economic costs of the Paris Climate Agreement, and it would cost each American $11,000 per year to meet the Paris Accords. This isn't going to help anybody if, people can't afford to be taxed an extra $11,000 a year. So, where are these policies going to go? What's the real reason for them? Because they don't even seem achievable in the slightest sense. So, what's the real reason? Maybe the proposed solution that they're laying out isn't the goal. Maybe the tools that they mean to try and reach their goal is the end. There was a great in quote in 1984 where they say, one does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard the revolution. They establish the revolution in order to safeguard a dictatorship. And you're like, that's how I see this kind of stuff. I don't really see I see the tools that they're using, which to be tyranny and control and compulsion and coerciveness. I see those as the meaning for all of this, because it doesn't seem like their policies are even measurable or to see if they can be successful. So we're talking about different generations of scientists being able, you have to track even whether what we're doing works. It's madness.
Yeah. And when it comes to COVID or climate change, we've already discussed that the experts do have a track record of being wrong. I feel a little weird to say this, but who has had a track record of being right in the past couple of years? Conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
That's,
man.
Yeah, so it turns my perception upside down. Like, I used to view people like Alex Jones or any conspiracy theorist as a nut job, but now I'm looking at them with a fresh perspective, thinking, hey, you know what? It's time that we give them a second chance.
Yeah, and I do think Alex Jones is a bit of a nut job for sure. But and I think it's one of those things where if you see this picture, let's say even 60-70% of what he thinks and says is right. To hold that in your brain for 20-30 years and be trying to explain it to people to essentially no avail, and just see people blindly walking towards what totalitarianism essentially, and that's going to have a very negative effect on your psyche. And I think that's what happened to Alex Jones. Was he probably just the stress of focusing on this stuff for 20-30 years, and of course he's gotten some things wrong, and he's gotten some big things wrong. But it's weird. The term conspiracy theorist is such bullshit in a way, because it didn't start popping up in general vernacular until the 1960s when the JFK assassination happened. All of a sudden, the CIA started talking to media outlets about wanting them to overuse the term conspiracy theorist and essentially turn it into a pejorative. And, I think too it's really strange what gets you labeled a conspiracy theorist because, I won't say anything that I cannot outline as like this is where I've got this information from. This is what it's based on. So you say things like, all right, there's a global agenda taking place to revamp, to essentially switch capitalism into something called stakeholder capitalism, which is essentially communism for the common folk and capitalism for the upper class, the elites, and their catchphrase is you will own nothing and be happy, and they want you to eat bugs, and you can say all of this kind of stuff and people are like, wow, that guy sounds like he's fucking off his rockers, he is insane, what a conspiracy theorist. And then you're like, this is in their books, they've written books on this, they publish all of this on their websites, like they speak about this openly every year at Davos. And so it's not to me that, like, I reject the term theorist. Like, there's no theory here. I'm just literally commentating what these people say they want to do. I'm not putting any real. I'm not shoehorning any perspective in there, really. I have my own things that whenever I'm talking to friends, maybe I will. Like, I'll be like, oh, I don't really have any. I feel like this might be at play, but like I don't really have anything to back it up. Like, sure, in private talk, but anything I've ever said in a video or made online, it's like it's to even have the label conspiracy theorist is weird when you consider that it's all coming from their mouths.
It goes to show the importance of linguistics, because conspiracy theorist is just one word. Then there is
Yeah.
misinformation super spreader,
Yeah.
anti-vaxxer, anti-science, climate change denier, transphobe. It doesn't
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
It doesn't end.
Yeah, and there are just all these labels that, get tossed out to the point where, and they consume society to the point where people all of a sudden, they're so afraid of being labeled. And dude, I get it. Like, I walk around, I still don't find it easy to, have these conversations and put this stuff out there online. Like, it's still very, very threatening because you're like, I don't want to be called that. It's not fun. I think it's one thing that I just have to accept comes with the territory, but there's a lot of people that will just not say what they think anymore because they don't want to be called those things, and I get it. Like, it's the human need, the psychological need for group cohesion and to feel like you fit in and that you're not like a social pariah, because essentially that's where if you were a social pariah a couple hundred years ago, you were dead. So it's like, to avoid feeling those things, we'll shut our mouths, and yeah, so I think that's a big thing. And to your point about the linguistics and tossing these pejoratives out there, I think they do great harm, and I mean, they're effective for the people that put them out there and use them.
Uh, when I came across these conspiracies, not even conspiracy theories, these documentaries that clearly show the amount of war crimes committed by, let's say, the US government, uh, can we conclude at this point confidently that the US government is the world's largest terrorist organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's they're the largest funders of terrorist organizations. I'd probably put it that way. Um, I think it is. I go back and forth on that all the time, and I do try to. I do think American foreign policy is completely broken, though. I think they lost any moral credibility they had after World War II. It's funny that, especially when it comes to things like Ukraine or even Afghanistan, all of this kind of stuff. I mean, there's not really been a point since World War II that America hasn't been at war with somebody, and whether it's being done covertly or overtly, but before World War II, their stance was on foreign policy was we're not going to be engaged in foreign wars and imperialism. Essentially, even in World War One, a large reason that war kicked off was because of strife between all the different empires and regions in Europe battling over their imperialistic efforts in Africa, and the wars that were kind of happening down there were kind of starting, that energy and emotion was starting to find its way into mainland Europe. And that was kind of what helped light the fuse for World War One. And at that time, America was sitting there going like, "What are you guys all doing? This is stupid." And that was essentially their official position. But then now you see it and you go, America is just top to bottom the global puppet masters. They're trying to be, at least. And I think a lot of people are, you see a lot of countries right now cutting their strings. You see India started to kind of like not put themselves in complete allegiance. They haven't completely broken off, but even Japan just recently went and bought oil directly from Russia above the price cap, which essentially says that they're not on board with American sanctions anymore. And so, all of these kind of things, I think America's really polarizing themselves with the degree that they're trying to play world police on. And I do agree that a lot of people will be like, oh well, they have to uphold democracy and all this kind of stuff in foreign nations. And I go, until America stops overthrowing democracies with coups in the CIA down in places like South America and the Middle East and all this kind of stuff, and in Africa, until they stop overthrowing governments and killing democratically elected leaders, I don't think they get to play the protectors of democracy.
Yeah, isn't it time that they disband the CIA?
I think so. Fuck. It's like even now too. They're never. The CIA was never supposed to, and they're technically not allowed to operate on domestic soil. But it's like they're spying on everybody. Like they're in all these chat websites, going after people, stoking people, getting people riled up. The CIA is. I think they're one of the worst organizations in the world.
Yeah. All right. Switching to a slightly different topic. Firstly, Happy Pride Month. What are your thoughts on wokeism?
Um, I I've I try to think about it as what it really is, which is Marxism. It's very easy to sound hyperbolic calling things Marxist and communist, but I think when you understand the roots of wokeism, essentially, I tend to just call it social justice now, because I think there's been, people in the quote unquote woke crowd will constantly say, well, define woke and all this kind of stuff, and play word games again, linguistic games, when we all know who we're talking about. But so I try to just talk about social justice and social justice activists. But yeah, if you look at the underlying narratives, essentially, of this ideology, which is that society is built upon fundamental power structures, and those power structures, the only reason they exist is to be put in place to essentially facilitate oppression, and the only difference between, say, communism, which was that there was a class war between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie, essentially the middle class and the lower class. They've switched it, and this comes from postmodernism. I actually did a YouTube video on this. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called "Where Do Woke Ideas Come From?" and how back in the 1970s there was a bunch of French philosophers that birthed postmodernism, and they all had Marx. They were all self-declared Marxists, and the assertion from postmodernism is that there is no such thing as objective reality. It's all subjective experience. They focus a lot on identity politics and stuff like that as well, essentially like normative behaviors. So really what it is this social justice / woke ideology is a mix of Marxism and postmodernism, in the sense that they've changed the original narrative of oppression lying between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie to between identity markers. They just say that, certain identities essentially make up these classes. That, okay, it's the bourgeoisie is. I've made this joke in a video before, but it's like the bourgeoisie is the straight, cisgendered, straight, white Christian male, and it's like the proletariat is the black, Muslim, trans, fat, disabled woman. So it's like it's one of those things where the rhetoric and all their proposed solutions, it's all the same. These are why all these people tend to want to overthrow or smash capitalism, in their own words, all of this kind of stuff. It's just I think the most interesting point to think about that is with the Marxists in the 1970s. A lot of Marxists were really shook in not understanding why communism wasn't taking over in the Western world, because it was doing so well in the Eastern world, right? With the Soviet Union, with China, Vietnam, Cambodia, it was really spreading. And these intellectuals, these Marxist intellectuals that wanted to see a global revolution, because that's what communism states for, is it must be a global revolution. They said that the reason it's not taking hold in the West is because in the West, the proletariat, the worker, is actually kind of served by the system quite decently, where those places, they aren't revolutionarily mindset. They don't have a revolutionary mindset because their life is pretty decent. Whereas the places, if you look at the places where communism did take hold in the middle of the 20th centuries, it was a lot of places that, Russia was pretty much still, they had technically gotten rid of feudalism, but the structure in the average life was still very, like, people were still living in serfdom, essentially. Then you look at China, it was very much similar. All of these regions that it took hold, there was really truly oppressive systems in place, but in the West it was this capitalist society that kind of was rising, the typical quote, a rising tide lifts all boats, and that was kind of what was happening and why communism didn't take hold in Europe and in America, in North America and stuff. So these Marxist ideologues, they had to rebrand it into something that the West would accept, and that's essentially what they've done with social justice. Is like, okay, they've weaponized Western virtue and morality against itself. This was there's a really good video on this actually too, of Yuri Brezhnev. He's a ex-KGB agent. You can find it on YouTube. It's like a 30-minute interview, and he breaks down, essentially he calls the process ideological subversion, of sending a bunch of ideologues and activists into American institutions like the education system and all of this kind of stuff, and then rebranded communism and shoved it down the children's throats. And look where we're at now.
Yeah, as a result of rise in wokeism and LGBTQIA plus philosophy and trans children, there has been a retaliation. I see all these memes on internet where they say reject modernity, embrace tradition, or embrace masculinity. You see the trad wife movement. You see women wearing sundresses and going to churches or mosques or whatever, and a lot of people are saying that the West should return back to its Christian roots. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, see, and this is I don't really have hard thoughts on this yet, because I'm still trying to really formulate how I feel about all this, because it's interesting. Growing up, I was an atheist. I think I was an atheist mainly out of ignorance and pride. I kind of had that, like, very juvenile idea of, oh, this invisible man in the sky, like, blah blah, and just writing it off like that. Oh, these are just like stories, and it's easy to sit there and be like, oh, that's a book from 2,000 years ago. And now it's so funny how dumb of a thought that is, to write something off just because it's old, but then not to sit there and go, is there a reason that this has been so so popular and like central throughout human history. Like maybe it is important then if if something lasts that long, then maybe there is some value in it. And so I've started trying to look at religion more as a story. Like humans in general, we operate on narratives, on stories, and that's why stuff like this media control and all of that is so successful. Is because that's how our brain is hardwired, is to make stories of things. We don't really operate on hard facts and stuff as people would tend to think we do. So I look at it as, okay, if you wanted to transfer a bunch of knowledge and wisdom from generation to generation, yeah, maybe you would do that through very deeply woven and mythological stories that are easy to remember. And then all you have to do is remember the symbolism of these stories and the wisdom that's imparted through them, and they're not meant to be legitimate, like you know factual truths per se, but it's more so the knowledge taken that you can take from understanding the stories and what they mean. And so I've definitely been changing my tune and kind of more so, instead of, I think before with the whole atheism kick that I was on, I was mistaking a dislike of organized religion for religion itself. And so now I've been able to kind of separate the two, because I do think the church abuses its powers just like any institution has. So I do still have a bone to pick there, but I think the religious nature is, I've pointed it out with social justice. I think it is inherently religious. Like we've already kind of covered here, they prophesize about apocalypses, which is climate change. They talk about gender identity as if it's like a soul existing outside of the body. The experts are your prophets or your priests that are able to interpret the sacred text, which is the Bible, or the science and all this kind of stuff, right? So I think I'm starting to change my tune and be like, okay, religion isn't something that you can really get away from. So but then I definitely am not well versed in the religions themselves and what they preach and teach, but I'm starting to open myself up a lot more to the idea of religion. And I do think that there probably is a little bit of a necessity in society to have something that kind of keeps the moral fabric together, because even I think, I don't know if they're admitting it to themselves or not, but like a lot of the atheist intellectuals, like the Dawkins and the Harrises of the world and all of this kind of stuff that I used to like watch and really enjoy, like Christopher Hitchens isn't around anymore, but he was a very influential thinker on me in my early days. And I think I would wonder if they would look at what's happening in society right now with all of this kind of cultish socialist behavior, and thinking and going like, yeah, maybe there does need to be some sort of underlying religious narrative that holds a society together. Because even interestingly enough, Marx pretty much laid out the fact that communism was a religious structure and belief. Like that's why every communist country has perjured the religious institutions and shut down churches and stuff, is because the state has to become the church in communism. The people can't have faith in anything but the state. So I think that's where maybe having different institutions for people to have faith in, I think maybe the church is necessary in a safeguard against dictatorships.
Yeah, hi. That was actually really insightful, and 100% agree with you on that. I think there is a sense of need for religion because people are looking for mythologies and stories to find inspiration from. And I kind of blame these neo atheists like Sam Harris and Dawkins for the rise of wokeism. I think by getting rid of religion, they created a void in the West and that
Yeah.
void had to be filled with wokeism and these new religions.
Yeah,
Whether
and I agree because even, it's funny we say that because right here, it's like, yeah, like literally on my desk, I've got The End of Faith by Sam Harris. But, I think if you look at what's ended up happening with what's going on in the West, everyone is super wrapped up in their identities, right? Whether it be their race, gender, sexuality, all of these kind of stuff, these immutable characteristics that these things shouldn't be our driving force in our identities of makeup of who we think we are, of what we're capable of, and what give us motivation in our day-to-day life. That's not what we should be driving these things from. And I think when we got rid of, or as Nietzsche would call it, the death of God, I think the consequence of that was a loss of identity, and I think that's why we're so kind of hyped up on it right now, and this idea that you can just identify as whatever you want, and that's where you're going to drive meaning and purpose from your life. I think that is a direct consequence of, you know it is kind of playing God in a sense and shutting down, and I think that's what religion offers, in the sense of like, okay, there's something happening outside of here that's much greater than me that I'm not in control of. And I think there's a deeper plan for me in the world, essentially kind of gets rid of that idea of just wrapping up your identity in yourself. There's something much bigger than myself out there. And I think when we get in our own heads about that, and which, I think atheism and general nihilism does, I think that's where we end up, yeah, split across race, gender, and sexuality lines and all this kind of stuff, because you're not looking at it as humanity in at a very bird's eye view of humanity. You're looking at very, where do I fit in and all this, rather than just understanding it's one big puzzle.
yeah. Listen, Liam, I don't know if you're married or if you have kids, but doesn't all these things kind of demotivate you to have children in the future?
Yes and no. So like, it has, in the sense of, I don't want to in the current circumstances I'm in. I'm not married. I don't have kids. I do want to at some point in my life, 110%. Like I know I want that. But I think now I've gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, I have to make enough money, and like, the idea of raising kids traditionally, as say me and my wife both getting $50,000 a year jobs, settling down, and kind of like public school system, and like really relying on society in a sense with the way it is. I don't want to have to do that, but if I can get to the point where, and this is where I've started trying to start my own business on the media front, is because there is a certain level of freedom and control and power over your life that being financially free gets you. And so I want to be able to do that so that I can raise my kids in a way that I would see fit, and that I like. Even now, like, dude, it just came out in Ottawa, in Canada here, that there's a school that has instructed all of their teachers to refer to all kids as they them, to not gender any kids, and all of this kind of stuff. So like, I'm like, yeah, I have to make enough money to send my kids to a private school where I can show up at that private school's door and be like, hey, teach my kids mathematics, and or else I'm pulling them out of here, because that's what I would want to focus on. So it is kind of like, to me, doesn't change whether I do or don't want to have kids. It just changes the circumstances under which I want to have them.
Yeah. Uh, in the West and even here in India, I feel like I feel like democracy is failing. And we recently had a state election in my home state here in India, and I was demotivated to vote. I think all the time, like, what's the point of voting? What's the point of elections? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts? Has democracy failed?
See, I'm split on these in both ways as well. I think traditional voting, I think it has failed in a lot of ways. I think you can look at that more so not necessarily the it's the illusion of choice. I always kind of liken it to the fact of it's like we're all on a big ship and we're headed to the same destination no matter what, but we're arguing about whether we want to go left or right around the island that's in our way. And it's like, but the ship ends up at the same destination no matter what. So I think voting in that sense definitely is a little bit. I don't think. Don't get me wrong, it's better than not being able to vote, but I think it's not the ultimate control and checks and balances that people think it is. And but I do think it is extremely important for us to recognize that where we spend our money is essentially the most important thing. That's your true vote in a capitalistic society. Your money is worth a lot more than your vote. If you go support local businesses, and even this is something that I've tried to focus on doing over the last year or two, is being like, okay, going to the local fruit vendor or going to the local butcher instead of going to these giant corporate global corporation Walmart stuff, that kind of, or going to the local coffee shop instead of Starbucks, whatever, all of this kind of stuff. I think that is much more important in this society, and that's how I focus on having as much control and influence as I possibly can in this society, because at the end of the day, money rules here. So, and I think if and you even see that right now with a lot of what's going on with these, Bud Light's a good example of it, right? They try to push a political agenda, and the people push back, and they vote with their money, and they say, no, we're not on board with this. And so I think that's one of those things where, again, you don't even have to disagree or agree. It's the fact that that is what has an impact in this world.
Yeah.
Except, sorry, I'll just add one point. Except it also sucks, because if you actually go trace it back long enough, it's pretty hard to get away from the Black Rocks and Vanguards of the
Yeah.
world. You're supporting them one way or another, no matter what.
Yeah. Exactly. Speaking of the whole Bud Light controversy, do you think Dylan Mulvaney secretly knows that? Sometimes I feel like he, in his head, is like, I'm fooling the public. I,
Yeah, I think he's probably insulated himself to the point where he thinks that for sure. I think the circle around him with how much attention's there and all of that. I think that is probably enough to make you delusional for sure.
yeah, and it's a crazy time for sure. I want to conclude the podcast asking a very vague question.
No
Oh,
problem.
what is the purpose of life?
I think the quote that I don't know whether it's a purpose per se, whether there's like a grand idea, but the quote, probably the most influential quote that I've ever had that has changed my entire perspective on the world and life itself, was Nietzsche, where he said, to live is to suffer, and to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. And so I think that is the overall arching. I think it's very easy, especially in this Western world, for us to focus on quote unquote happiness. It's, oh, I need to live a happy life. What makes me happy? And the truth is that things that it's essentially what you're talking about at that point is just dopamine. Like, what gives me dopamine? And then you can sit there and go, there's lots of ways that you can make yourself momentarily happy that end up making you long term miserable. Like, if you pizza will give you a big happiness kick, but if you eat pizza every day all day, you're going to be pretty fucking miserable about your position pretty soon. So I think it's much more important for us to focus on meaning. And I think if anyone ever wants to learn more about what that looks like, I think Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is probably the best path to go down for that. Yeah, you've got it?
I'm pretty. Hold on. Yeah,
Yeah.
found it. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a fantastic book, and so I think looking at that is much more beneficial to us as humans to find something that gives us an underlying meaning and drive in life and gives us a sense of fulfillment, because there'll be many days, like even the shit that I do right now, and I take a lot of meaning from what I do, but there's a lot of days where it's a grind, it's a slog that I don't feel like sitting down writing. I don't feel like, recording. I don't feel like editing my videos, but it's just like I know that delaying that gratification in the meantime, not necessarily doing what makes me happy in the moment, but that ends up making me feel a lot more fulfilled in the long run, and sitting there going, okay, I'm actually, even if there isn't any big effect from my point, it's like I can at least I sleep a lot better at night knowing I'm something that is passionate, and also I like to think important. So
Yeah, this was a very meaningful and insightful conversation. Thank you, Liam,
yeah,
for
I
coming on the
had a great
Labyrinth.
time. Yeah, no, this was amazing. Thank you so much for having me, brother.